I want to welcome everyone to the University of Miami for the screening of Bending the Arc, which is truly an inspirational tale of friendship, hardship, and the ultimate grace that's found in never giving up. Dr. Knaul and I had the opportunity to see this documentary at the Miami International Film Festival back in March, and as soon as we saw it, we immediately wanted to screen the film here at the university to share with faculty, staff, and students. So not only were we successful in bringing the film to the university, we are extremely, extremely fortunate to have Dr. Yong Kim with us to learn, to tell or talk with us about the lessons learned from his incredible experience in building partners in health and the implications that that has for the future of global health. Of course, as you know, we were also expecting Dr. Paul Farmer, and he truly had an exceptional situation that at the last minute forced him not to be here, although I'm sure he would love to be here since he is a native of Miami. But the good news is we get more time to hear from Yong Kim, and I'm so grateful to him that he was able to take time of what I know is an incredibly hectic schedule to spend the day with us. I don't think he needs a very long introduction, but let me just remind everyone that Jim is currently the president of the World Bank Group. He's the first president of the World Bank who doesn't come from the traditional backgrounds you would expect, but rather he's both a physician and an anthropologist and a person who has really devoted his life to international development. When his appointment as president or election as president of the World Bank was announced back in 2012, right? I mean, it took everyone by surprise because it was a very different profile, but it signaled exactly the desire from the main institution involved in international development, financing international development and providing intellectual and technical guidance to that process. It signaled a radical shift in focus and one that many of us saw truly as a breath of fresh air in the landscape of global development and the pursuit of justice. Of course, prior to going to the bank, Jim had an incredible career. He moved there while he was, or having served immediately before as president of Dartmouth College. Again, a first in that particular setting. And then having held professorships in both Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health, where I had the opportunity of benefiting from his wisdom when he was the director of the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights. And prior to that, he had been at the World Health Organization directing the HIV and AIDS program, where he led the famous 3x5 initiative, which really presented the first global goal for access to AIDS treatment, and really was the beginning of this extraordinary feat in global health, which has been the expansion of treatment in health, while continuing to emphasize prevention and a comprehensive approach, including also the fight against stigma. Jim is one of the smartest people in the world, as you will see. He was a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and he's been all around a prodigy child. He's now a prodigy president of the World Bank. So we are really delighted to welcome him at the University of Miami. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let me also say that we are incredibly grateful to be accompanied by friends and family of PIH and the Farmers. So while Paul couldn't be with us today, we have both Jeff Farmer, who worked to make this event possible wherever he is. And he looks a lot like Paul, just a little bit
There he is. There he is.
Lanny's also a great friend of this program. How can I talk about being better developed? Now tell me. And Dee Dee Bertrand-Farmer, who's a great leader in the cause of women and girls, as well as health. And we're very grateful you're here. But also Lanny and Lori and Jenny, who have been longtime supporters and friends of Partners in Health and of the work of this university as well. So thank you very much for joining us. That's sort of only one thing I wanted to say about who's up here and not up here. Now, I was thinking, when I was a student beginning to consider doing global health, my dream was to sit on a stage with giants, global health giants, Julio Frenk and Yong Kim. So I married one of them, which makes it somewhat easier. But I didn't think I would ever get to moderate a panel thinking about some of the events which are in this incredible film that marked innovation, change, but I think more so hope for those of us who were choosing to study global health at a time when there was so much we thought we couldn't do. So it was the signal of hope that what Jim was doing, Paul was doing, what came to BPH, what's in this film, signaled for those of us who were studying. So for me, this is a hugely important opportunity. And to be able to bring Julio, our president, and a leader in global health into this discussion as well is truly a unique opportunity for us here today. So the Miami Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas and our Miller School of Medicine is thrilled to be able to have you join us. I wanted us to start thinking about what's in the history, what's in Bending the Arc. And I said how much it meant to those of us who were studying global health to have that hope. But we heard about it, we never actually got to see it, and now we can see it, visualize it, feel it more as it is in this amazing, amazing film. But Jim, can you talk to us a bit about what it meant to be taking those bold steps at that time? And then I thought we could move towards a conversation about the future.
Well, first of all, it's great to see so many students, and it's just a real privilege for me to be here with both Julio and Felicia. You know, they've both done just tremendous things in the world of global health, and they could tell you the story as well. I mean, what you'll see, you know, the great danger in seeing this movie is that you'll see some of the scenes in there, and you'll say, "Oh God, I can't believe they said that." You'll see a scene in there where the head of the U.S. Agency for International Development says that it's impossible to provide HIV treatment in Africa because Africans have no conception of time. They know morning, they know midday, they know dark of night, but they don't have watches, they have no conception of time. How can they possibly take HIV medicines that need to be taken 5 times a day? Well, it's wrong on so many levels. It's not 5 times a day. And, you know, this gentleman who was the head of USAID had visited Africa a few months before he made that statement, and the people in Africa said, you know, the only one who was late for every meeting was that guy, was Andrew Natsios. And so, you know, it's easy to laugh at them and easy to vilify them. But, you know, we were just talking, you know, Felicia did her PhD in economics, and, you know, the prevailing sort of you know, accepted wisdom of the time was that you'd never provide treatment for HIV because it's just not cost effective. It doesn't make any sense from a macro economic perspective. And so the most important thing to remember is the guy, Andrew Natsios, he's a good man. He's a very good man. He is a decent, caring guy who was making an argument that seems ridiculous, and it was, but he was simply representing the overwhelming view of the entire global health community. I mean, you know, Felicia and Julio were there, and there were, you know, not 10 people, 10 physicians in the world who were advocating for treatment of HIV, and every single other physician in the world of HIV were saying, no, you can't do it. And so think about the implications. And what I kept going around saying was, look, if we turn around and say to the 25 million people in Africa who are living with HIV, sorry, it's too difficult, it's too complicated, you're all dead. If we had done that, I kept saying that we will be remembered as the generation who let 25 million people die because it was just not worth the time. And you know, it's almost like you can't believe that they did that, oh my God, but that's not the point. The point is not that they were such terrible people. The point is they were all good people, good, caring, loving, friendly people. And the question is, what is happening right now that is the equivalent? In other words, what are the people that we're ignoring? Who are the people that we're ignoring? What are the problems that we're ignoring right now? And because the common wisdom is just so clear, oh, well, I mean, we've done a lot, but that's impossible. That's really the question I want to leave you with. And as you walk out the door, the question, you know, it's not, you know, we really, Paul and I both tried very hard to push the film to not make this about our heroism. It had nothing, this should not be seen as a heroic movie. It should be seen as a movie where we started off with some very clear convictions. And the convictions took us a long time to get to. I mean, we really were in the middle of our PhD programs in anthropology. We're looking at every kind of a take on social theory. We were reading Marx. We were reading the contemporary social thinkers, Pierre Bourdieu, even crazy guys like Jean Baudrillard. We were reading all of them, and we were trying to get a sense. So does the Frankfurt School have the best idea about what is to be done? And we ended up with a bunch of Catholic priests. We ended up with a conclusion that the people who brought together the idea of liberation theology, which is really quite simple, a very simple notion of making a preferential option for the poor, which means that you're not against anyone else, but your preference always will be for the poorest. And then took that and kept asking ourselves, what does that mean here? What does that mean here? What does that mean in Haiti? What does that mean in Peru? What does that mean in Chiapas? What does it mean in all these different settings? Because we started with that conviction, I think what I hope the film will show is it really saved us from getting caught up in the received wisdom of the time that ended up leading to many, many poor people not getting access to care. And so, the question you should ask yourself is, what is your foundation that you're taking into any kind of discussion? Because if your foundation is, I'm an economist and I'm only going to do things that are cost effective, you walk into a situation and you end up making decisions that 15 years later, people will say, how could they have done that? How could they have told 25 million Africans that they're just going to die? How could they have told all these millions of people with MDR-TB that they should die, and they should die quickly as possible, please, because we don't want you to infect anyone else? What are the things that we're doing today using the received wisdom that in 15 years will be thought of as unbelievable and inhumane? I can give you a list of some of them, right? 25% of all the children in the world are stunted. In other words, for the medical students, you know what that means. That through some combination of malnutrition, lack of stimulation, their brains are as much as 40% smaller than their non-stunted peers. They will never be able to compete in the digital economy of the future. But what are we doing about that now? Hunger still exists in so many countries. We don't have there's no, a movement to try to stop that right now. Gender-based violence. The women who are victims of gender-based violence, it's an outright pandemic in the world, and we're trying for the first time at the World Bank Group to have a specific policy on how we tackle gender-based violence. There's so many things that are happening right now. So that's my message. That in order to immunize yourself from getting caught up in the sort of received wisdom and end up making decisions that will look just terrible in 15 years, I think you've got to start with, well, what am I really committed to? What's my foundation? And what would happen is we'd walk into these rooms with people like Andrew Natsios, and we would say something that would unsettle everybody. We'd say, but wait a minute, they're human beings. And we've shown in Haiti, we've shown in Peru that you can treat these people. And so please don't tell us that it's impossible. Well, okay, it might not be impossible, but it's too expensive. Well, we just lowered the price of these drugs by 90%. So don't tell us that it's too expensive. Well, then, you know, you have to make priorities. Well, gee, there's a lot of money in the world, and what if we were able to dramatically increase the amount of money through, you know, what ended up being the Global Fund and PEPFAR? So, you know, the people that didn't walk into the room with this fundamental conviction about making a preferential option for the poor, that was on some level, it was on both intellectual, moral, and even in a sense a spiritual level, not a denominational or religious level, but on a spiritual level. That's what it took to immunize ourselves. And you know, I'm still trying to do it at the World Bank Group. It's much harder, right? But it's easier if you're president of the World Bank Group, actually. But you know, I can tell you, you know, this is still the question we're trying to ask, and that's why we set in 2013, 9 months after I got there, the target of actually ending extreme poverty in the world by 2030.
So I think we're speaking here about the intrinsic reasons to invest in people and invest in health, and why we don't think of cost benefit. And I wanted to share a little anecdote. How many of you have taken like Economics 101? Okay, so I remember this is actually a graduate class, and right, one of the first things you learn is that people choose how they invest their money, right? They choose to invest in guns or butter. Did you see that? Yeah. And I asked this question, and I said, well, what about people who only have enough money for their food? And you know what the answer I got was? That's such an uninteresting case for us to study. And we're perfectly, but I was the only one who was shocked by the answer. Now, from an economics point of view, at least theoretically, mathematically, it was a pretty uninteresting case to study. But what I wanted to ask you about as the president of the World Bank Group is, from an investment point of view, from a human capital point of view, what's the new way of looking at that?
Well, it's you know, a very close friend of all of ours that we've all worked with for many, many years, Chris Murray. You know, I had been spending just tons of time trying to get donors to be more generous for global health, and it worked. And you know, we went from I think Julio, maybe in the mid 1980s, late 1980s, maybe there was a couple $100 million total for global health, something like that. It was just almost nothing. And that's when Paul and I and a few other people, we started Partners in Health in 1987. And then there was literally no money for global health. And you know, we always thought that the thing to do is if we could get more donors to be interested in global health, that would really solve the problem. So Bill Gates got involved, then there was the Global Fund, then there was PEPFAR, and it was amazing. For the first time, we had tens of billions of dollars. But it's not nearly enough, right, Felicia? I mean, it's not, right now, everywhere I go in the world, what we're seeing is that people's aspirations are going up. And everywhere I go, it's just stunning. And I was just told last week that by 2020, in just 3 years, 2 years actually, Africa will have universal access to 4G LTE. So there will be broadband in every region of Africa. So even if you can't afford a smartphone, there may be somebody around who has a smartphone. And we actually know what happens when you get access to broadband. People's aspirations go up. The reference income, the technical term is your reference income, the income to which you compare your own, actually goes up. So aspirations are going up everywhere. And so aspirations for better health, for better education, they're going up too. And that one piece of data, 155 million children today are stunted. Well, if we don't prevent that from happening to the next generation of children, and if we don't intervene quickly with the children who are already stunted to try to provide better nutrition now and better educational programs, what's going to happen is that they're going to also have high aspirations, and because they can't compete, they'll become very frustrated. And so I'm really worried about just fundamental stability in the society going forward. And so after having spent so much time arguing for more generosity, maybe there's a chance that there'll be more. But I think right now, looking at the tax structures and the economic growth in the donor countries, I don't see it. And so I feel almost desperate to figure out some way to focus people's attention on things like health and education. So what we're now finding With our friend Chris, we did a very simple, I made a very, I thought, a simple request, which was, now that we have so much more data on health outcomes, and now that we have so much more data on education outcomes, what has been the role of improving health and education outcomes in economic growth? And it turns out that nobody's ever asked that question before in quite that way. There's been a lot of talk, of course, health and education are important for economic growth, but we've never had the level of specificity in health and education outcome data. And the important thing is we're looking at outcome data now, not input data. We've known, this is the percentage of the budget you spend, this is the percentage of your budget you spend on education, but we haven't had this kind of outcome data. And we look back, and what Chris found was that if you compare the top 25% of countries who've improved their human capital, meaning their health outcomes and educational outcomes the most, and you compare them with the bottom 25%, this is just a very simple top quartile, bottom quartile comparison, the top quartile grew 1.25% of GDP faster per year over 25 years. And so when our economists saw that, they said, oh my God, this is the strongest correlation we've ever seen to economic growth. And so it's quite possible that because we haven't been able to ask this question and do the kind of analysis that we've done, that we've been missing for all these years just how important investing in health and education is. Now, it doesn't mean that infrastructure and tackling climate change, those things are unimportant, but now it looks like we're going to be able to make the case that this is probably the most important improvement that has led to that this particular improvement explains economic growth over the past 25 years better than almost anything else. And so if you look forward, given that automation is going to remove a lot of the low-skilled jobs and that everyone is going to have to compete more and more in a digital world, it probably is going to get more important with every year, health and education, than it was even for the last 25 years. So it was, when we saw these numbers, our chief economist, who Paul Romer, who many of you may know who are in economics, who is every year on the list of the short list for the Nobel Prize in Economics because of his endogenous theory of growth. He said, I have never seen numbers like this. I've never seen correlations that are this strong. So, what for us was a moral argument, preferential option for the poor, it turned out that the economics were also very much on our side. We didn't know it at the time, but it turned out that we were right.
So we talk more and more about being in a world where, as Julio would put it, we're victims of our own success. And we live in a world where more and more so-called non-communicable and chronic diseases that are plaguing the health not only of the rich, but also of the poor. So we have, I think, an opportunity to have two very different perspectives on how to approach that. And I'm thinking, one, Julio, if you can tell us, how did you do this as Secretary of Health from a country point of view? And I remember the day that you were trying to decide what disease to include in the Fondo de Gasto Catastrófico, when there wasn't enough money for all the diseases. How did you make those decisions? And then, Jim, tell on the global health front, what is the way, what are the ways, how can we think about meeting the challenges of ever more complex diseases?
Well, before answering the specific question, I wanted to I said before, I wanted to just reflect a little bit on this question of being victims of our success. I think Jim didn't say it. Maybe he doesn't want to spoil the movie before you watch it. I've already seen it. It's an incredible story. But what we saw with the case of AIDS in particular is just an incredible example of how the standard thinking that tries to oppose what happens in a country with what happens globally is so flawed. And I think this is a special moment when we need to remind ourselves, at a time when, leaders in, not just in this country, but around the world are saying America first or China first, or, everyone says first, my country first. I think the AIDS story illustrates this notion of interdependence, which to me is the core element of global health. Global health is not foreign health, it's not what happens in other countries. Global health is about the way in which we are totally interdependent in a way that no matter how powerful a country is, it alone cannot address all the challenges it faces in this matter. And in a way in which you need to have that global perspective of interdependence, even to improve your own situation. I certainly can tell you from my experience in a national setting as Minister of Health of a country, I had joined that having just worked in the World Health Organization, and to me, there was a continuum. It was not like I was on the global level, working at WHO, and then I moved to the national level. It was all totally interdependent. And AIDS is an example. It's truly a pandemic where what happened around the world was, first of all, that the presence itself of the disease was itself linked to complex networks of interdependence. We're all interrelated, there's movement of people, and probably that contributed to the transmission. There's also movement of ideas and lifestyles that maybe also contributed to the disease. There's a complex web by which a disease that was originally identified in the United States, in the west coast of the United States, rapidly became a pandemic. But then what happened is that the production of the ultimate global public good, which is research through knowledge, led to a quick understanding, first of all, an identification of the causal agent, and then the design of effective interventions. First prevention, and then treatment. And I think what led to the point where Paul and Jim and Partners in Health become absolutely critical is the point where we have an effective treatment except it's very expensive. And when antiretroviral therapy appeared, it was very expensive, about $10,000 per person per year for a treatment that you basically needed to take the rest of your life in countries that were probably spending between $5 and $15 per person per year on health care. So, I mean, it was totally unthinkable. And that's where the traditional thinking process of economists kicks in, and it says, this is not cost effective. And suddenly we're faced with a world where you have one part of the world who doesn't die from the same disease as another part, and another part, and by then the majority of cases. And it takes a group of dedicated people who then rescue elements of a perspective, whether it's liberation theology or the old concepts of solidarity, which we need to revitalize. Yeah. As I heard Jim recently talk, and I hope you'll touch on that point in Seattle, that launch a movement that, to me, we talk of the great victories in global health, and we always point to the eradication of smallpox. But what happened with AIDS, to me, is in exactly that league of achievements, in which, over the course of a few years, there was this concept of international collective action, where countries forget who's first and who's second, and everyone acts towards a shared goal. And the goal was to expand access to treatment. It was started by this gentleman to my right with the 3x5. It was started by the absolutely rebellious attitude of places like Partners in Health, which refused to take the standard thinking. And it started initially as a moral argument. So I'm trying to connect to the second part. Yeah. Eventually, it became clear that the main drag on the economic growth of Africa was the AIDS epidemic, and that if you wanted to do one thing to promote growth in Africa, dealing with HIV/AIDS was the thing to do. Then we discovered other interesting things about this. It became clear that this was also an instrument to enhance global security, because it's those kinds of injustices in the world that breed the resentment that leads to extremism and other forms of threats to our common security. And it turned out that this was also incredibly effective diplomacy, because for sure, PEPFAR was the signature contribution of President Bush and the most distinguished and glorious moment of his presidency. And it greatly, at a moment when American prestige abroad was being rapidly eroded, it rescued that element and led to all these ideas of smart diplomacy. So it's a wonderful case that shows how all of these strands come together. And it started with what you're going to see in the movie.
Let me just jump in. But, so how that actually happened, though, was that there were AIDS activists who were on treatment and were doing fine, and they just decided, they made the decision from their perspective that, well, look, we put our bodies on the line and literally did testing these medicines, and now that there's a treatment, we're not going to let it just be for ourselves. But especially for the students, part of the breakthrough was that I had studied the pharmaceutical industry for my PhD dissertation. And I knew that every price of every medicine is in fact just a social construct. It's a social construct in the sense that because you put money into it and because you have you have a patent over a certain amount of time, during that amount of time you can charge whatever you want. So this is why the hepatitis C cure costs what, $90,000, $100,000. There's a rationality to it, but it is a complete social construct. And I had studied this, and I knew that the actual cost of making an AIDS drug was about $30 for a year, not $10,000, about $30 for a year. And so we made the argument that why don't we just go with the generic manufacturers, and we can do it for $70 a year, and the Indian and Chinese drug manufacturers that will actually make a good profit, and let's just treat everybody. Now, all those arguments that Julio made, the security argument, the economic argument, we had been making those arguments for a long time. But what really changed everything was that the activists were willing to embarrass people in power. They were willing to show up at their offices. They were willing to show up at their public appearances. They were willing to chain themselves to the White House. It was that activism that got everyone's attention. Nobody wanted to be embarrassed. And so just learned so many things. That first of all, whenever someone tells you you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to understand how much of this is real and how much of this is a social construction. So any of you studying sociology, anthropology, the social construction of reality is something that you should think hard about. But at the end, it's still, there were just a whole bunch of accidents that allowed it to happen. I mean, I think, we talked about it there, President Bush, he was just moved on a very personal level. And he made, I think, the most important decision in terms of getting there. But if it hadn't been him, and if he hadn't been moved personally, I just don't know what we would be talking about, because we were more than capable of letting 20 million people die in Africa, and Africa has been growing at about 5 or 6% over the past 10 years. We would not have had that. It would have been probably probably have led to just absolute chaos. So that's one of my messages. It'd be great if we could take some questions. One of my messages: you guys have to ask yourselves, what is the equivalent of saying that Africans don't have watches so we can't treat them, that are existing for you right now? Maybe it's not even in Africa. Maybe it's not in a developing country. Maybe it's right here in the United States. That's what vision really means. Vision means that you can see today the things that in 15 years, young people just like you will scoff at, that we could ever have lived in a world that did things like that to each other.
And if I can just answer your question, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. We are victims of our own success.
Yeah.
So as we get these victories, because we're all going to die of something. So now, you have this emerging series of other health challenges. that then create that imperative. And I will tell you that from a national decision maker perspective, a big part of that is to be attuned to what's happening globally. To me, it's another example, because one of the things you achieve in making those very difficult resource allocation decisions is to understand what's happened, to learn, to engage in a process of shared learning. And this is where institutions like the World Bank become very important. It's sometimes more than the money the bank lends, is the ability to bring the experiences from others to bear. And now, because of the success in dealing with some infectious diseases, we now worry about non-communicable disease. I think that becomes even more important than before.
And so the background that I gave you guys about looking at the correlation of health and education, improved health and education outcomes to economic growth, what we're going to do is I announced this with Julio at the University of Washington, that I announced that we're going to do it in a year. And then why on earth would you announce something that you're going to do in a year? Because this is going to be so controversial. We're going to actually do a ranking from 1 to 190. So the best country in the world in terms of human capital and the worst country in the world in terms of human capital. Now, we do a ranking every year called Doing Business. And it's a very simple thing. It's not perfect. There's a whole bunch of flaws. But it's the only thing that exists that ranks countries from 1 to 190 in terms of how easy it is to start a business in that particular country. And the countries just go crazy every year, right? The ones who rank high love it, publicize it in their newspapers. The ones who rank low come and scream at me about the methodology. Every year it happens, the same thing, right? So this is going to be even worse, because a Doing Business ranking is one thing, but your human capital stock ranking. And so I'm already getting people coming to me and saying, oh, you better not do that. It's going to be very controversial. And they say things to me like, well, if you do that and we're not ranked as highly as we think we should be ranked, the opposition party is going to get very mischievous, right? Exactly. That's exactly what's going to happen. So for the first time in history, we're going to be able to do this ranking that says, here is your stock of human capital. And then we'll also be able to say, and here's a likelihood that you'll be able to be competitive in the future. And I think literally for the first time in human history, for leaders, especially heads of state, heads of government, and ministers of finance, for the first time, they're going to be worried about where they come out on a ranking of how well they've invested in health and education. Because every single head of state, every single minister of finance I've ever seen can wax poetic about how important health and education is, but they don't invest in it, right? Some countries, I get in trouble by naming specific countries, but one large country in Northern Africa spends 0.76% of their GDP on healthcare. In the United States, we spend 17%, 0.76%. And 90% of what they spend on healthcare comes as donations from the outside, right? And so we have a situation in which the leaders in poor countries are saying, you give me the money, I'll spend it on health. If you don't give me the money, I won't spend it on health, and I'll try to get money from elsewhere. So the way to tackle NCDs, the way to really put on pressure to create health systems that actually deliver across the spectrum, because you have to, in order to go up the ranking, you have to deliver across the spectrum. From our perspective, we're going to still ask for more money. We're going to ask for people to be generous. We're going to continue to put information out there about how to improve outcomes, but we're going to rank them. And the reason I announced it for the next year is that it's going to take us a year to let everyone scream at us about methodology, right? And they will. They'll say, no, you should consider this. No, that data's not right. This other data that shows us better. But then we're going to get there, and there is going to be pandemonium, right? Because certain countries that have always felt themselves to be superior to their neighboring countries, if over a beer I can tell you which ones they're going to be, they're going to come out ranked lower. We know that already, that they're going to come out ranked lower, and it's going to cause pandemonium in those countries. For the first time, for Christ's sake. And this is now pandemonium that's going to finally, I hope, benefit the poorest people, not only on infectious diseases, not just vaccines, but on non-communicable diseases, and as we were talking today, even things like palliative care for people, at the end stage of their lives with cancer. Among all the inequalities, this is another one of the huge inequalities, that people with cancer in developing countries die miserably in excruciating pain. We know that. We can fix it. But I think the way to fix it is to make it absolutely irresistible for heads of state and ministers of finance to invest in poor people's health, because if they don't, they might not get reelected.
So, what we've heard from two of the greatest minds in global health is that we can dream of a future where a child in Africa who gets acute lymphoblastic leukemia has the same probability of survival as a child in Canada. We can dream of a world, this is my case, where no person has to live and die in unnecessary treatable pain. And we've heard a little bit about how, and we'll see, how this was done some years ago and how our leaders think this can be done in the future. And so my questions are, tell us how you would like to participate in this. Talk to us a little bit, well, to Jim and Julio in particular, about your thoughts before we go in and see this film.
So
In other words, Q&A.
Yeah, you guys can, there's 2 mics. You can line up behind the mics if you have questions.
In addition, he runs the World Bank. He also runs the... And so I know, because we're going to be talking about it in a minute as well, is that one of the things we should also talk about is our new work on, and here comes a T-shirt,
Okay.
on PIH Engage Miami. So let me start to the left.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is unrelated to PIH Miami, but I had a question about how we can reconcile this priority on human health and equality of access to health with planetary health and climate change.
Why don't we take, I'm just thinking very good, why don't we take 2 or 3,
Sure.
and then we can answer those. So let me go to the right.
My name is Suzanne Garber, and I'm the founder of GAUSE, which is the world's largest database of hospitals outside the United States. I'm on faculty at Temple University as well. And I would like to respond to Felicia's request to engage with you. I have amassed over 20,000 hospitals in our database. I'm the former COO of International SOS. I got sick abroad. I'm a 2-time cancer survivor. I've been hospitalized in about 8 different countries, grew up overseas. I would love to help lend the information in my database to help you with your initiative. So I just wanted to make that offer as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're on.
Yeah.
One more.
I wanted to know how the Miami community could get involved in PIH's work.
So,
Funny you should ask.
okay, I knew the plan.
Do we have somebody from PIH Engage who wants to answer that question? Go ahead. We'll start with that.
Hello, everyone. This movement is going to be starting a branch here at the University of Miami, and students are welcome to join us. We have 2 board members who are sitting outside, Calvin and Gabby. They help check you in here, and after the event, you can go ahead and ask them any of your questions. We also have a sign-in on a laptop at the front desk. So put in your information, put in your contact information, and we're ready to get you started in our movement.
Okay. So PIH Engage is part of PIH, and so there's like a whole team of people at PIH who reach out and will provide information and support, right?
Yes.
I think. So if you have a question, let me go with the question on climate change and human health. My job at the World Bank Group is to resist the or word and always use the and word, right? So how would we, for example, move quickly to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius? We need to keep it even lower than that, but we're already past 1.5. So how would we do that? Well, so one of the things is that the World Bank can no longer be the enemy of the climate change activist community and has to lead it. And that's what we've done in the last 5 years. When I joined, we were not even allowed in the room during climate change discussions because we were thought of as the bad guys. So we, in 5 years, we turned that around, and we're now the largest funders of climate change activities in the developing world by a lot. We're going to be at $30 billion a year by 2020. But that's not enough. What's needed is really investments in the trillions. So I see there's more than enough money in the world to transform our energy use into renewables, and at the same time provide every single person on Earth with a good quality health and education. Here's how I would do it. Okay, so first of all, the size of the global economy is about 75, 80 trillion dollars. That's every year. That's about how much money passes through the economy. 80 trillion. Out of the 80 trillion, there is now 11 trillion dollars, about 10 trillion dollars, sitting in what are called negative interest rate bonds, and that means that normally you give money to a bank and they pay you interest. Well, in this case, you give money to a bank and you pay them interest. You pay them to hold your money, right? And this is, I mean, we don't have to talk about monetary policy, but it's a result of efforts to stimulate economic growth. So 10 trillion sitting in negative interest rate bonds. Now, if we could mobilize that 10 trillion to, instead of sitting in a negative interest rate bond, be invested in, say, solar energy in India or solar energy in Africa, that would change everything. And so that's what we're doing in terms of climate change. We need to make huge new investments in a completely different kind of infrastructure. And according to Elon Musk, lithium-ion batteries are going to be 10 times cheaper and 10 times smaller within the next 2 years. So when that happens, that will also change everything for the renewable energy world, because it will mean that we can use solar and wind, which is intermittent by definition. The sun's not always out, the wind's not always blowing. The storage capacity will get so much better that even with intermittent sources of energy, we can use it for what they call base load. In other words, it will be a continuous source of electricity. So there are plenty of ways to tackle the climate change problem that are not being addressed right now. And so this is why on December 12th, President Macron of France, myself, and the Secretary General of the United Nations are going to convene another meeting where we're going to put all these deals on the table and we're going to pull all that money off the sideline. Okay, so $40 trillion, about 60% of the global economy is sitting not doing anything. We're going to mobilize that money for climate change. But in order to do that, the most important thing is to have a price on carbon, which we're also working on, right? So I just want to assure you that I'm on it, right? And in fact, it's what I started with, right? Because as a medical doctor, I couldn't walk into the World Bank and start with health. I mean, people. Amartya Sen, who is a good friend of ours, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and Felicia's mentor and thesis advisor, was on me for 4 years saying, Jim, you need to do more about health and education. We were working on health and education, but we had to be able to answer that question first before we went to this human capital thing that we're doing. So there will be plenty of money, but unless we have a price on carbon, it won't go quickly enough. So, one of the things we've learned over the years is that market mechanisms accelerate processes in ways that nothing else that human beings have come up with can accelerate processes. So in China, President Xi Jinping will tell you that he's head of the largest communist party in the world, but the global market system is what in his words, the ocean we all swim in. And so the key is to make sure everyone can swim in that ocean. And so he will tell you that their unprecedented feat of lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty was not possible until they embraced the market, right? And that's really what led to the change. And so climate change is exactly the same thing. There are so many successful meetings. I mean, I can't tell you how many successful meetings I go to. And the climate agreement in Paris was another successful meeting. But everyone was so busy celebrating that successful meeting that we didn't put any of the deals together. So right now, we're trying desperately to get the market mechanisms going so that everyone is trying to come up with low carbon solutions to all the different problems. It doesn't happen yet, right? So that's the other part of it. We're going to do it, and for health, right? So the people ask me, well, you're putting all this pressure on us now to invest in health. Where do we find the money? Well, let me give you 3 off the top of my head. 1, most countries have fossil fuel subsidies. They subsidize the price of fossil fuels. And the evidence is overwhelming that benefits rich people 6 times more than it benefits poor people. The rich are the ones who own the cars and the trucks and get the benefit of the subsidy, and the poor don't. So if you got rid of fossil fuel subsidies, it would both reduce the carbon footprint of that country, and you could use that money for health. Another thing, tobacco tax. Tobacco taxes are so much more effective than we ever thought they'd be. And you can, and what happens is, health-wise, tobacco taxes help the poor a lot more, because the poor reduce their smoking a lot more than the rich if you put a tobacco tax on. And then you take the tax and you put it back into health programs. And then finally, if you started just collecting taxes from the rich, you know, in many countries in the world, poor countries, the only people who pay taxes are the ones who are too weak to refuse to pay taxes, right? And so if you started actually collecting taxes at a rate of 15 to 20% of GDP, you would have more than enough money to pay for all the new health outcomes, right? So bottom line, there's more than enough money, there's more than enough ingenuity, there's more than enough solutions to tackle both climate change and healthcare, and don't let anyone tell you that you have to choose between the two. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Willie Chartman. I'm a first-year medical student at UM. So you gave us kind of a taste of your philosophical perspective on kind of like cost-benefit analysis and conventional wisdom telling you couldn't do something and proving them wrong. But given that, what do you think of the effective altruism movement and their focus on trying to quantify and rank order charities and interventions that are most effective?
It's a great question. Well, why don't we do one more? Yeah.
Short. I'm Adriana Grossman. I'm a second-year medical student. Before that, I was a student of healthcare administration, and before that, public health. But coming from that background, I wanted to ask about the topic of diplomacy. You talked about how making these decisions and integrating health and economic success was an appropriate, if not inspiring, diplomatic decision. I wanted to ask about how we as students moving forward can sort of break down the social construct of isolationism that we've sort of constructed here and across the globe.
Yeah, these are both really, really good questions. Altruism, can you just say a little more about what that is? Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my quick summary or elevator pitch to people is basically the idea that Peter Singer kind of popularized, which is that a child starving in Africa and you not helping is the moral equivalent of you seeing a child drowning in a pool and not trying to save them because you don't want to get your clothing wet or dirty or whatever, right? And so the effective altruism movement, which I think a professor at Oxford, William McCaskill, has also popularized, is the idea that we should try to rank order charities and interventions to see what's most effective per dollar and kind of make moral decisions on that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Peter Singer's work. I'm sure Julio has some really interesting, as Felicia. Here's how I would look at it. All right, so I had the opportunity to meet Pope Francis, and we spoke, and I told him about, in Spanish, una opción preferencial para los pobres, and he said that's my philosophy as well. But the other thing he did, and he keeps doing, is he's incredibly critical of capitalism, and he's incredibly critical of people who do business, right? Just incredibly critical of them, and so he's an amazing person. It was an amazing experience meeting him. But I think he got that part fundamentally wrong, right? And so I think altruism is a very inward-looking thing, right? It's all about your own sense of charity or compassion for others. And it would be great if everyone took the Pope's advice and shared more, right? But I just have to tell you, I don't think that's a very good strategy to lift everyone out of poverty. And so, this is why I keep quoting President Xi Jinping all the time, because what President Xi Jinping is saying is, we tried to equalize outcomes. We tried that for decades, and it didn't work. I mean, basically saying it made us all equally poor, right? And so that didn't work. And we knew in China at that time, more than 60, 70% of their people were living in extreme poverty. And so Deng Xiaoping came along and said, some of us will get rich first, comparing, the market system versus planned economies that trade with each other. He said, I don't care if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. And that released something in China. And so I have to tell you, in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, we really thought, well, which system is going to win? Is planned economies that trade with each other going to win, or is the market system going to win? Well, right now, that debate is over. And there are no pure devotees, students of the global market capitalist system than the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Vietnam, right? And that's what we do with them. They keep their socialist system, according to them, but they know that in order for them to create jobs and create livelihoods, they have to engage the global market capitalist system. And so the reason I bring up the Pope is that the papal nuncio came to the bank during a meeting, and I rather cheekily, I said to the papal nuncio, I said, Cardinal, with great respect, and this is something I'd like you to tell the Pope, right? That for the first 25 years of my career in global health, I knew nothing about finance. And now I've spent 5 years learning about swaps and leverage and insurance instruments, all these things that rich people use every day to make themselves richer. And it turns out you can use all of them for poor people too. And I said, I think that for 25 years, me being ignorant of finance was a sin, right? No, so it was a bunch of, our faith-based group was sitting around the table and everyone laughed, of course. But I think that's right. I mean, I feel like I was talking about making a preferential option for the poor, and I was blissfully unaware of the fact that, hey, we can get the insurance industry to insure poor countries against pandemics, which we did, right? We can take $10 and turn it into 50 so easily, and then have a much bigger impact. I just didn't know this stuff, right? So the altruism, I worry about it because I don't think that tapping into the altruism of every human being is going to get us where we need to go, for example, on climate change, right? So how many times have I said, think about the world your children are going to live in, right? And when there's a hurricane, they think about it for about 10 minutes. And then when the hurricane passes, they forget, right? Pandemics, right? During the height of the Ebola outbreak, everyone said, oh my God, this is terrible. How is it possible that we didn't have any mechanism that immediately kicked out? Oh, it was terrible for about 2 weeks. And then after Ebola was off the radar, nobody cared about it, right? So it would be great if people became more altruistic. I haven't seen evidence that that's going to happen. And so what we're trying to do is to put in mechanisms that will every year renew themselves, right? So a ranking of human capital, every year it'll come out. And every year it'll put pressure on the people who need to be pressured the most, heads of state and ministers of finance, right? Because no matter how generous everyone is, it's not going to be anywhere close, right? In terms of climate change, it would be great if people really thought about what world their children are going to live in, but they don't. They forget. And so a price on carbon will force them not to be able to forget. Deals that will make them money will force them not to be able to forget. So market mechanisms work on the opposite, on greed, right? And so that, unfortunately, has proven to be far more reliable as a way of driving certain outcomes than altruism. So I don't want you to feel like I'm moving away from this need to be altruistic. I think it's great, right? But what I also see is that lots of people who are in that world, it becomes a preferential option for my altruism, right? And what you'll see here is that the most important thing about a preferential option is what it's not. It's not a preferential option for your heroism. It's not a preferential option for your altruism. It's not a preferential option for your program, your intervention. It's not a preferential option for any of those things. You have to be agnostic about that. And you have to say, what does this mean for the poorest people? So for me, what it's meant is, we created an insurance instrument, right? So we actually insured the poor against pandemics, right? Rich people are insured for everything. Poor people are insured for nothing. And we were able to do it because we had the financial tools and we had the financial acumen, right? So I hope what you hear and what you see from this film is that continuously asking, okay, I'm not going to make a preferential option for me or for my ideas or for my heroism or for my organization, my union, whatever, but it's going to be for the poor. You're going to be forced, I think, to ask a different set of questions than you would otherwise. Right? Now, I'm really worried about the discussion that we're having right now. And I've recently someone sent me a book about the universities and the role of universities during World War II, right? And as I read that book, I'm thinking, oh my God, this is exactly what they were facing. The great universities in the world actually participated in the movement against Nazism, right? And they were among the strongest leaders. President Conan of Harvard was the strongest voice saying that we need to get involved in the war because bad things are happening, right? Now, I think you guys at the University of Miami are lucky because with Felicia and Julio here, right, you're going to see two people who are going to engage in the world, right? But I have to say, I think that the universities have been pretty silent over the last 5 years in terms of engaging the global discourse, right? And what you see instead is things like, what are they called? Trigger alerts, what is that? Do you guys know? You guys have those here? I heard that and I thought, oh my goodness, microaggressions, right, that happen in class. Look, I'm all for diversity. I'm all for creating environments where people feel comfortable. That's all fine, right? But there's also the issue of macroaggressions that are happening out in the world. And I tell you, the universities have not participated in turning that discussion backwards. And I can tell you that in the 1930s and 40s, the universities were at the center of a very, very important discussion about whether to go to war, whether to send young people to war to fight against some of the same ideas that we see now today. I mean, in reading these histories, it's not that different from today. It's very similar ideas, right? And so I would just say, one, you're lucky because these are two people who've always been engaged. They're not going to disengage. But that all of you in the room have to think about what is your role going to be? I mean, so many of the great universities are looking inward again, right? They're focused on things like campus politics or trigger alerts or microaggressions, making sure that no one ever feels uncomfortable at any point during any of their college education, as opposed to saying, because we're at a great place like the University of Miami, what's the nature of my responsibility to the rest of the world? And I would suggest that it's significant.
So this is...
Going over time.
That's okay. That's more than okay. This is the perfect lead-in to 3 announcements and our feature film for the evening. So there are 3 ways in which we are talking about new engagement in global health. One is that we're going to be following up on a major Lancet commission by thinking about, with the World Bank, how to work to make prices right and access right for non-communicable diseases and beginning with cancer. So I invite all of you to participate in that project because we have to have some very solid ideas to be able to make sure that we can actually access all of that new funding. The second is that we are launching today PIH Engage, and as our friend mentioned, the inaugural president, Calvin Antonetti, and Vice President Gabriela Pajes, who I'm sure are outside today, are going to be launching us into an era in which we'll have new opportunities for our students to be able to work on these global issues, and I'm thrilled and honored to be the faculty advisor of that initiative. And the third is that having spoken with our Dean of Nursing, and having spoken with our Dean of Arts and Sciences, and about to speak with all the others, we feel it's very important that there's a huge amount of work being done on equity and global health on this campus, on the Gables campus. And we need to know who you are and what we're doing. So we're going to be holding a series of town halls to try and get a map of all of what we have to offer to equity and global health on this side of the campus, on the Gables campus, and be able to, I'll ask for an appointment, Julio, be able to present that to the president and think about how we can truly engage arts and sciences, nursing, business, education, and all the other wonderful, rich schools that we have in the Gables campus to be able to support and work closely with our medical school, with Barth and others on global health. Those are our 3 take-home to-dos, and we'll have this semester and next to do good
Can I
on
say
them.
one last thing?
You're going to
Right.
make me do more work than that?
No. One last thing. So I just want to say, I'm here because of Julio and Felicia, right? These are two of the finest minds and the finest people I've ever known. That's why I'm here. You guys are very lucky, but let me just tell you, being president of a major university like the University of Miami is the hardest job you can ever imagine. You have no idea how hard their job is, right? Because when I was at Dartmouth, they used to tell me, being president of a university is like being in a desert with a gale wind, and you have 4 sides of a tent. And those 4 sides of the tent are students, faculty, alumni, and staff. Right? And all 4 of those sides have very different ideas about what they're doing and what they need and what the tent is supposed to do. And at any given time, one of those things can go up. You can have problems with staff or faculty. It's impossible. It's the most, I have to tell you, I've done, you'll see MDR TV, HFA, nothing compared to being president of a university. So I just want to say these are 2 of the finest people you will ever meet. Listen to them, but please support them because you're very, very lucky to have them.
So imagine being married to one. Jim, thank you for joining us, for taking a whole afternoon to help us to think about how the University of Miami can engage, for doing all the work that's in the film and all that's going to come forward. And we are totally here to support and work on the new Human Capital Project. Enjoy the film, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to all of those who worked on this, and especially Jeff Farmer.